Great. Okay. All right. Well, I just want to welcome everybody. This is the first we have in a series of webinars that's being hosted by Project Wild. We're here to celebrate all things, all Earth Month long. My name is Elena Takaki, and I'm the Director of Professional Development and Conservation Education at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And one of the programs that I manage is Project Wild. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Mark Lefebvre. The two of us will be monitoring the questions in the chat throughout our time here today. And so next slide, please, Carrie. The one after that, there we go. Okay, so Project Wild, if you're not familiar with Project Wild, offers professional development for formal and non-formal educators. We have a number of guides available, which you see on your screen here, including Flying Wild, Aquatic Wild, Growing Up Wild, Climate and Wildlife, and the classic Project Wild, which we call Project Wild Terrestrial. And next slide. So it is my pleasure to introduce Carrie Wickstead. She's going to be our presenter today. And Carrie is the Amphibian, Reptile, and Invasive Species Program Manager for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, where she helps collaborate on national issues such as the illegal trade in North American turtles and aquatic invasive species. And in her role, she also serves as the state agency's coordinator for the Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, aka PARC. Carrie holds a BS degree in Wildlife and Fisheries Management from Frostburg State University and an MS degree in Biology from West Virginia University. I also want to add that I've known Carrie for a number of years. She's also the former Project Wild coordinator for the state of Maryland. She's also the State of Maryland Environmental Educator of the Year a couple of years ago, and the Project Wild Coordinator of the Year a couple of years ago. So Carrie is an amazing and wonderful educator. Oh, she was also my professor as my teacher as I was going through my Master Naturalist certification. So I think you all are in for a real treat here. And Carrie, thank you so much for being with us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Elena, and I'm really, really excited to be here, and thank you for that very nice. So thank you again for coming here this afternoon for Scales and Slime, exploring the role of reptiles and amphibians. My name again is Carrie Wickstead, and I work with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and I also represent PARC. And PARC, for those of you who might be unfamiliar with PARC, is an unaffiliated partnership that focuses on forging proactive partnerships to conserve amphibians, reptiles, and the places that they live. So we have a ton of volunteers that make PARC work, and I represent National Park, but we also have regional parks like Northeast Park and state chapters like North Carolina Park. So I highly suggest getting involved with your local park if you want to do more and learn more about reptiles and amphibians. And we couldn't do all of what we do without our fiscal sponsors, the Amphibian and Reptile Conservancy. They're the nonprofit that provides financial support for PARC. So, starting off, amphibians and reptiles are collectively known as herpetofauna, and they're often lumped together. However, these two groups of animals are a bit different. So both amphibians and reptiles share certain types of characteristics. For example, they have vertebrae and they're ectothermic, aka they rely on the environment to maintain their body temperatures. So you might see ectothermy also be referred to as cold-blooded, and that's an easier term to teach kids about, but technically their blood isn't cold, it's warm. It's just more how they heat their blood is really focused on that environment and all of that. Amphibians consist of frogs, toads, salamanders, newts, and caecilians, which are worm-like animals with poorly developed eyes. And typically, amphibians need moist environments, particularly to begin their lives. So, you know, those eggs and those juvenile stages need those wet or aquatic environments to be able to start off. So in contrast, we've got our reptiles, which have scaly skin. They include things like alligators, crocodiles, lizards, snakes, and turtles. And they also can live in drier environments. And that's part of, where that skin and scales come into play. The other thing that I forgot to mention is that amphibians typically go through metamorphosis, where there's significant changes between the different life stages, like from the egg to the tadpole or the juvenile stage, whereas you don't see that metamorphosis happening with our reptiles. One introductory activity in the world of herps is to work on classifying these organisms by looking at shared and contrasting traits. And an activity that goes into this is actually found on the park education page. And Elena, if you could share that Wakelet link. So we'll share this link occasionally as I refer to resources throughout the presentation, and that's where you can find some more information. Thanks. So let's kick this off with a little trivia. True or false? In most southern Appalachian hardwood habitats, there is more salamander biomass than all other vertebrate species combined. Why don't you write in the chat true or false? And if you don't know, you can just write you don't know or put up an emoji that you don't know. But let's see. You think there's more salamander biomass than all other vertebrates combined, like bears, birds, fish, lizards, or is there less? Oh, nice crew we got here. So this is true. So this is true based off of some studies that were done at Hubbard Brook. And interestingly enough, one of the most common vertebrate species is actually the redback salamander. So that is, your trivia for the day. So not only are there a lot of salamanders in the southern Appalachian forest, but we also have the highest diversity of salamanders in the entire world found within the southern Appalachian region of North America. So that's pretty awesome to have here in this country. North America also has some of the highest turtle diversity in the world, second only to Asia. You can see the southeastern United States is that hot spot for a lot of our different turtle species. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to highlight the different roles that these organisms play in our ecosystems, particularly as predators and prey. In addition, some of these herps that eat fruits actually disperse seeds. For example, box turtles, which are common turtles found throughout much of the United States, they actually eat mayapple fruits and are well known to disperse those seeds. So there's a very good chance if you see mayapple somewhere that a box turtle pooped there one day back in time. So there are other ways that they disperse seeds too. Interestingly enough, some research with rattlesnakes found that by consuming rodents that had eaten seeds, they can actually disperse seeds, which is mind-blowing that those seeds can go through the digestive tracts, partially at least, in the rodents and the snakes, and still come out the other end and able to germinate. Reptiles and amphibians, through foraging and nesting and burrowing habits, also help cycle nutrients within these systems. They're removing the soil and getting those nutrients all nice and mixed up. And some species, particularly some of our salamander species, are very sensitive to changes in the environment. So we can look at them as ecosystem indicators, or those proverbial canaries in the coal mine. Finally, adaptations that reptiles and amphibians possess, like venom or their sticky feet, have been used for medical advances and biotechnology to help people. And I see a couple people who are commenting that they like those toes in this photo. And so these are high-powered pictures of gecko toes, and they're designed to be able to stick to surfaces. And researchers are looking at ways to create adhesive materials based off of how gecko toes work. So really fascinating stuff there. Scientists have also recently shown that many amphibian species biofluoresce, and biofluoresce at different life stages. So biofluorescence is the ability to absorb visible and ultraviolet light and re-emit it at a lower energy level, like blue light being re-emitted as green light. We don't know why these amphibians biofluoresce just for sure yet. We think that some parts of them, like the venters of them, biofluoresce to make it a little easier to find each other for mating and all of that, but it's still a really interesting field that we have to look into a bit more. And some of this research was done by Dr. Jennifer Lamb, who is part of PARC. From here on, I'm going to focus on some different species of amphibians and reptiles that you might find around North America, as well as some information about them. So starting off with our frogs and toads, which are types of amphibians, I'm going to kick it off with the wood frog here, which is one of our early frog species in eastern North America and in terms of emerging in the spring. It can be found in the forest of Alaska and the Northeast, and these cool frogs can literally freeze into frog sickles to get through long winters in their northern environments. They have this glucose, which is a type of sugar, in their blood that keeps them from freezing during these extreme Arctic temperatures. It's basically like their own antifreeze in their blood. And researchers are looking at how this adaptation works to be able to provide cryoprotectants for organs, particularly when dealing with organ transplants and surgeries and all of that, because they can still protect their organs and still use their organs even after these deep freezes, which is a really fascinating adaptation. Moving along to our bullfrogs, they can be found across North America. And so they're native to the eastern United States where I'm found, but in the western parts of the state, they're considered to be more of an invasive species. And invasive species are non-native species that cause problems. So even though they're native to the eastern North America, they can still be invasive in the western part because they didn't naturally or weren't naturally found there. And those checks and balances that we have here in the east aren't necessarily found in the west. One of the biggest problems with bullfrogs is that they're voracious eaters, and essentially anything that fits in their mouth is fair game for them to be able to eat and consume. Not only do they eat a lot of stuff, they breed a lot, so they're extremely prolific, and they have the propensity to carry disease. So when you get all of these things together, they can have some pretty negative impacts on species of reptiles and amphibians in the western United States, as well as other species. And some of the researchers that I'm working with are actually looking at gut contents of bullfrogs, and it's amazing and slightly scary of all the things that they're eating and potentially having an impact on. The final species I'm going to talk about on this slide is Woodhouse's toad. And so this is a species of true toad, and true toads have warty skin, but are still considered to be amphibians. So you can't really see it from this photo, but behind their eyes, they've got these big glands called parotid glands, which distinguishes the different types of true toads based off of other toad species found around the world. Woodhouse's toad is mostly found in the central United States and up to parts of Washington state. So it gets up into a little bit of that Pacific Northwest. They kind of sound like sheep when they're calling, and they eat a ton of invertebrates. So keep an ear out and see if you can listen for these as it gets a little warmer in your area. Moving along to salamanders, I know somebody, at least one person in the chat, said they love the hellbender. And the hellbender is a wild salamander. It is also lovingly known as a snot otter or a lasagna lizard. They're the largest salamanders found in North America, and as their snot otter title suggests, they are quite slimy. They have these special skin folds, which you can kind of see here in the back of this picture, and that helps them be able to absorb oxygen, particularly in fast-moving streams, which is where they really, really need to live. If they are found in slow-moving water, sometimes not enough water will pass over those skin folds to give them enough oxygen to be able to support themselves. So the Chinese giant salamander is actually the largest species of salamander in the world, and it can reach lengths up to 5.9 feet in length, so almost as tall as a 6-foot human. There are also Japanese giant salamanders that are 5 feet, and hellbenders come in about half that size. So all of these species in one way or another are threatened or endangered, and a lot of that is due to habitat loss, and some of them are also threatened due to overexploitation. So people taking them from the wild for pets, for food, and for other things. And at some points in time, sometimes these animals had been persecuted just because of their appearance and tales about what they do. So this is a picture of a hellbender from West Virginia, so you can find them in the eastern North America. There are two subspecies, the eastern hellbender and the Ozark hellbender, and the Ozark hellbender is mostly found around Missouri and Arkansas. They live in these big mountain streams, particularly ones that have these large rocks within them. The males will nest under those rocks. They actually pick out the nest, attract the females, and she'll lay her eggs there under the rock, which he'll actually guard. And that's pretty unique in the salamander world, having any adult guarding these eggs, particularly having an adult guard those eggs. The reason I have the crayfish here is that their main diet source is crayfish. And there was a study that I went to that looked at all their diets, and almost half of it was made up of crayfish. So it's a very important part of what they eat. So salamanders control pests by eating insects like mosquitoes, and they also help become food for larger animals. But there are some exceptions to that rule. Newts are actually a type of salamander, so all newts are salamanders, but not all salamanders are newts. And newts in particular are semi-aquatic, and this is the rough-skinned newt, which you can find up in the Pacific Northwest. And you can probably guess where it got its name, because it does have that kind of rough, drier texture to its skin. Interestingly enough, this one has some of the most toxic poisons found in the world. It's called tetrodotoxin. And so it's something that it secretes from its skin to essentially prevent predators or deter predators from eating it. Interestingly enough, some garter snake species have started to essentially evolve resistance to the rough-skinned newt venom, the tetrodotoxins, so they're able to eat some of these newts. And from what I've read, it's kind of like an evolutionary arms race between these newts and the snakes to be able to one-up one another to see who can eat whom. Versus, who can't eat whom. Moving along to another chunky salamander. This is the marbled salamander. So this is a species that you'll also find in the eastern United States. They're one of our mole salamander species, and they're called mole salamanders because most of these mole salamanders spend much of their time underground. So in the east, we have species like the spotted salamander, the eastern tiger salamander, and the marbled salamander. And out west, you mostly have these western tiger salamander species for your mole salamanders. Now, the marbled salamander is kind of unique in the eastern mole salamander world because they actually breed in the fall, whereas everyone else in the eastern North America where I'm at, they're all breeding right now. This is the party time for a lot of our amphibian species. Excuse me. And these marbled salamanders will actually lay their eggs in areas known as vernal pools or temporary wetlands. But since they lay their eggs in the fall, a lot of times these wetlands aren't filled with those winter and spring rains. So they really, hedge their bets with laying those eggs before those pools have filled up. But if they do succeed and those pools do fill up, those eggs hatch first, and those larvae are able to eat larvae of other organisms like their spotted salamander cousins when they're just first forming. So an activity to teach about the amazing migration of these marbled salamanders, and when I say migration, it's not a long distance, but for a tiny salamander, it is a lot of travel they have to do. They have to emerge from their underground environments and head to those vernal pools, be able to breed and lay those eggs, and then go back home unscathed or mostly unscathed. So we took an activity from Flying Wild called the Great Bird Migration or Great Migration Challenge, and we adapted it for marbled salamanders to teach about all the hazards that marbled salamanders face as they're trying to migrate to those vernal pools to be able to breed. So it's an active simulation. You go to different stations and then you essentially roll the dice and see by the stroke of luck if you can survive or not. But it's an excellent way to teach about the life cycle of this species, the adaptations that it has, as well as the hazards that it faces during these migrations. And some of the hazards that were built into these activities are also ones that students and others can address on their own as individuals or collectively as communities. So that's part is that action is built into this activity. And you can find all those materials on that Wakelet that Elena has posted there in the chat. Moving along to our reptile species, and I'm going to start strong with our American alligator. So you might be surprised to know that alligators, or the American alligators, are a conservation success story here in the United States. They were actually placed on the endangered species list way, way long ago in the late 60s, but they were removed 20 years later in 1987. So they're one of those conservation success stories for the Endangered Species Act. Alligators, as you might imagine, are apex predators, but they also are considered to be ecosystem engineers. They create areas such as gator holes that help a variety of species be able to survive and live in some of these different environments. Unfortunately, by the 1970s, American alligators were close to extinction due to illegal hunting, habitat loss, and illegal black market trades for them and products produced from their bodies, essentially. However, their remarkable comeback in the late 1980s was facilitated by private farms regulated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, along with state game and fish agencies, captive conservation programs, and other ways of commercialization, like these gator farms that essentially allowed them to come back and repopulate. And so they're doing so well that in some areas, they're even starting to expand northward with climate change. So it's great to have a conservation success story in our reptile and amphibian world. Now, as I said earlier, amphibians and reptiles are ectothermic. And so there's a great activity in Project Wild called Keeping Cool that helps students learn about local reptiles in this case. And they have to investigate temperature and how it affects those different reptiles. And from there, they'll create these little reptile models, take them outside, and examine potential habitats that those reptiles can survive in. It's a really nice field investigation and great way to learn about local wildlife species. And these pictures are from when we piloted in Japan. So they got really into it, making their Japanese lizards, even with little eggs to go along with their model. And they tested out those temperatures in different types of habitats, like in the rock wall versus under a log or on the pavement. And so, so this is one of those activities you can check out with Project Wild. Moving along to our lizards, the largest lizards that are native to the United States are Gila monsters. And Gila monsters are only one of two venomous lizards found in the entire world. So Gila monsters are only found in the Sonoran, Mojave, and Chihuahuan deserts in southwestern United States, as well as in northwestern Mexico. Since they're kind of on the lazy side, they tend to prefer easy prey like eggs and newborn mammals. So they do eat a lot of rodents in that way, and that's an important thing that they do for the environment. They also, you can see this chubby tail right here. So Gila monsters actually store fat in their tails, and they can actually go for months without eating, just living off of the fat in their tails. So this is particularly helpful adaptation for them to be able to use to get through some of those winter months in some of these desert habitats where food might be scarce. Sounds like a good plan to me. Moving along from the largest lizard in North America or in the United States to one of our tinier ones, there's the pygmy short-horned lizard, affectionately known as a horned toad. They reach a whopping 2.5 inches in length. So you can see an adult here from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. These tiny lizards are found in California, North Canada, and are often referred to as horned toads. And even though they have kind of these toad-like faces, they're actually reptiles, so they are not toads or amphibians in any way. Interestingly enough, much of their diet is made up of ants. So when they hatch out of their eggs, the most abundant food item they're going to eat are ants. And even as adults, there was a study that found up to 72% of their diet was made up of ants. They use their cryptic coloration, as you can see in this picture here, to help camouflage themselves from potential predators. And while other horned lizards are known to shoot blood from their eyes to avoid capture, particularly from canids like coyotes, that adaptation hasn't been examined or observed in this species. Next, I'm going to talk about our turtles. And as Elena mentioned earlier, I'm heavily involved with work that deals with the illegal trade in North American turtles. And that uncovers species that might be common, like our box turtles, which unfortunately are declining across North America. You might be surprised to know that turtles are the most threatened vertebrate species, with around 60% of turtle species worldwide threatened with extinction. And turtles serve many different roles in their ecosystems. In the southern United States, the gopher tortoise is what we consider to be a keystone species. And we call it a keystone species because it creates habitat that supports so many other species. In the case of the gopher tortoise, they create these large underground burrows that often have multiple tunnels. And it's been documented that over 300 different species use those burrows. You have some species that need those burrows to live and survive, like some species like the indigo snake, which is a rare snake species found in the southern United States. You've got gopher frogs that use those tortoises. And then you also have species that use these essentially as an opportunity, or might prey on some of the species that are using those burrows. So there are many different ways that these gopher tortoises affect their environments and help other species. I have these picture here, these adorable burrowing owls, because occasionally they'll take over old gopher tortoise burrows and they'll use them as essentially their nest. But also sometimes they like to hunt outside of those gopher tortoise burrows because of the number of rodent species that will also use those gopher tortoise burrows. Moving along to a sea turtle, the largest sea turtle in the world is the leatherback sea turtle. So this is an endangered species in the United States, and it's extraordinary for many different reasons. One of the most impressive characteristics about the leatherback sea turtle is that they have the widest geographic and thermal range of any reptile species in the entire world. So our leatherback sea turtles can migrate essentially from North America down to Central and South America, and they can survive all different types of temperatures. And unlike our other sea turtles, which have those hardened shells on their backs, the leatherback sea turtles actually have almost like a leathery, bony plated surface. And this shell design is an adaptation that allows it to dive very deep depths to eat some of its favorite food, which includes jellyfish. It's wild to me that this giant, 1,000-pound turtle that's 6 feet long almost exclusively lives off of jellyfish, but here we are, right? And so this species, unfortunately, can be affected by things like plastic pollution, because if you've ever seen a plastic bag floating in the water, sometimes it can look a lot like a jellyfish. So one of the things we've done is created some activities to teach about land turtles versus sea turtles with an activity called Turtle Troubles, which I'll go into in a second. And part of that was also creating our own life-size leatherback sea turtle that you can see here. And this was essentially made by upholstery material from a local fabric store, and was really, really interesting for a lot of the students and other educators that we taught. And so we have plans on how to make your own online if you're interested in that. Moving along from the largest turtle in the world to the smallest turtle in North America, we've got this bog turtle, which is a federally threatened species that's found in the eastern United States. There's a northern and a southern population to these little guys, and they get about 4 inches in length for their carapace. And the carapace refers to that upper part of their shell, whereas the bottom part of the shell is called the plastron. So these tiny turtles live in a very special spring-fed wetland habitat that's pretty much open to sunlight. And habitat loss and degradation are some of the largest threats to this species, as well as things like invasive plants that move into these wetlands there. So this is a picture of a bog turtle wetland in Maryland, in central Maryland. So this is typically what you'd see, these tufts of sedges and skunk cabbage, and the bog turtles would live in between there and essentially bask on some of those hummocks. This is a picture of my friend Andy Adams with the Susquehannock Wildlife Society with an adult, just to give you an idea of its size. So not only is this species threatened by habitat loss, degradation, invasive species, and others, but it also is threatened by the illegal trade. And so this is a species that we think was hit really, really hard with illegal trade years ago, and it never quite recovered. And certainly because these populations are often really far apart, it's hard for them to be connected and be able to interbreed. And so that also is causing a problem for this species. So as I alluded to earlier, we have an activity called Wild at School's Turtle Troubles. And just like the marbled salamander activity, this was also partially built off of a flying wild activity. And so it teaches about the hazards and threats to bog turtles and to sea turtles like the leatherback. In the leatherback, you get into plastic pollution and how to reduce plastics and all of that. And for the bog turtles, we use this activity where essentially you have a habitat board. Go a little fast there. You have a habitat board, you have your little turtles, you have the students place their turtles on the habitat board. And then we have different scenarios where houses are built in the habitat or cars and roads become part of the habitat. Invasive species like purple loosestrife get introduced to these swamps. And with each of those scenarios, we see loss of those turtles or those turtles having to move and condense themselves into smaller and smaller habitats. So this is a great activity to teach about the threats to these turtle species. You can certainly adapt it to turtle species that you have in your different areas as well. We did make sure that all of the things that in terms of scenarios that we worked on, we tried to include some that were larger scenarios that had to be addressed at the community level, but also scenarios like having dogs off leash attacking turtles or raccoons that are attracted by trash being outdoors, those types of things that students can address on their own and in their own environments. So check out that Wakelet if you'd like access to this activity and its resources. So the last Project Wild activity that I'm going to talk about is turtle hurdles. And this is an active simulation of the sea turtle life cycle and their migration. And it's a great way to understand the hazards affecting sea turtles and actions to help. And you can see a group of Maryland wild educators that went through this. So we really like to get into it in Maryland. So we dressed up as nest predators like raccoons and crabs that were going after the eggs and the hatchlings of the sea turtles. We had trash monsters that were floating around in the open ocean catching some of our turtles. We had things like nets for fishing and commercial harvest happening. And so through it all, we had to see if some of our sea turtles could survive from egg to juvenile stage to adulthood long enough to be able to reproduce. So this is another very good activity to teach multiple concepts to students in a very active and engaging way. So last but not least, I'm going to talk about snakes, and I saved snakes for last just because they sometimes can be a little more controversial of the amphibian and reptiles. But snakes need love too, and some of them are really, really beautiful. Like look at this rough green snake here, one of our prettiest snake species that we have here in Maryland. One of the first things that people often think about when they think about snakes is snakes and the connection to venom and venomous species. So you might be interested to know that snake venom has been used for medicinal purpose for many, many years. Even back to like ancient Greece, we have documents of people using snake venoms for different medicinal uses. And if anybody is on blood pressure medicine, you know, or captopril in particular, you can thank snakes for that, because the first orally active ACE inhibitor, captopril, was actually manufactured based on how pit viper venom works. So we wouldn't have those drugs on the market probably if we didn't have those snakes and be able to study how its venom works. I apologize, my mouse is very, 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 you know, touchy there. So another type of medicine that's currently on the market and FDA approved that essentially is used for humans is agristat, as well as integralin. And these two drugs are based on snake venom disintegrins that are essentially antiplatelet agents. So they help with preventing blood clotting and strokes and things like that. There's also been a lot of research with snake venoms, particularly copperhead venom, and potential to attack cancer cells like breast cancer cells. or be able to provide pain treatment without the use of opioids for folks undergoing different types of procedures or even cancer treatment. So not only do people fear getting bitten by snakes, but they also fear of dying from snake bites. And I'm here to tell you that out of the many different venomous snake bites that happen around the United States each year, only about 5 to 6 people die. And often that is not solely due to the snake bite. It's usually due to the snake bite and some underlying health condition, like heart conditions. Interestingly enough, you are twice as likely to die from a vending machine falling on you here in the United States, and much more likely to have a TV fall on you and kill you here in the US than a snake bite. And certainly more people die from exercise each year than they do from snakes. So it's important to respect snakes and their space, but it's also important to know that death from snakes are few and far between. And far more people have been saved by the things like venoms, medicines developed by snake venoms and all of that, than people who have died from snake bites. So now I'm going to get into some different snake species, and I'm going to start with my favorite snake species ever. And this is actually the snake species that helped me become a fan of snakes, and that is the eastern hog-nosed snake. So there are also plains hog-nosed snakes and western hog-nosed snakes. So wherever you're at, there's very likely some type of hog-nosed snake that's there. Now, our eastern variety, their noses aren't quite as pointed as some of the western and Midwest species, but they still got that little pig nose. And that nose is designed to be able to dig into sand to find their favorite food, which is toads. As you can see from the pictures here, they're highly variable with their colors. Some of them can be completely melanistic, some of them can have these patterns, and some of them also are orange and black in color. And you'll see this in Maryland in places where we have like a lot of that orange clay in the soil and all of that. So the reason that I love hog-nosed snakes is they are complete and utter drama queens. They're so dramatic. So one of the things they'll do, if you startle them, they hiss really loud, and they'll fluff out their hoods or flatten out their hoods to make themselves look like a cobra. And sometimes they'll sway back and forth like I'm a cobra, but they give up on that really quickly, and then they decide to play dead. And so this is let me see if I can play this, a quick video of one. And I do want to note this is a stress response here. So it will do this very dramatic coil and roll around like, oh, I'm dead. It lets flies fly on it. It sticks out its tongue. It tries to be really convincing. And as you can see from the GIF here on the left-hand side, if you flipped it right side up, it will flip itself right back over and be like, no, I'm really dead. And then the babies are particularly cute because they haven't quite perfected staying still, so they'll keep moving around as well. And they do this just to get you to leave them alone, okay? And while it might be really tempting to harass the hognose, it is important to know that this is a stressful situation for the hognose because they literally think that they're going to die. So if you see hognose, please give them their space, just like everything else. Even if you want to see them do this, it's better for you and better for the snake not to be harassed. So, all right. So moving along to another common snake species. If you ever see a snake, particularly a black one, and the question pops into your head, how the heck did it get there? You're more than likely looking at a rat snake. And there's a Facebook group that I follow that's called Ratsnakes in Predicaments, which I totally love because they're not always the brightest. But I still love them anyways. So as their common name suggests, they often eat furry snacks like rodents. So they enjoy all things rodentia. But sometimes that also means that they can find their way indoors. And so people don't always appreciate that. So juvenile rat snakes look really different from adults. These are two pictures of eastern rat snakes. As you go across the country, you'll see different color variations and all of that. But this is an eastern rat snake from my basement. It got into my laundry room, They got this nice dark band between their eyes, looks like a little visor there, and the check pattern. And then as they age, they typically lose that, and they turn this this black color with the cream underneath their face. Now, much like the hog-nosed, they try to be non-confrontational, and they try to do a lot of acting to get you to leave them alone. And one of the things they like to do is they'll coil up in a tight ball, and they'll furiously rattle their tail, like shake it really fast and hit it on leaves to try to mimic a rattlesnake. And so that's what this little one was doing when I caught it in my laundry room downstairs this past fall. It was rattling its tail, trying to look extremely vicious. I wasn't fooled, but I did give it an A for effort. Now, when they get to these larger sizes, it can sometimes be a little convincing if you're not familiar with different types of snakes. And I used to get a lot of pictures of black rat snakes trying to mimic rattlesnakes. So people do see this quite often. They also will do a few other things, like sometimes they kink up their bodies and try to lay there and look like a big black kinked up stick. That also isn't very convincing. So they do a little bit of everything, essentially, to try to get away and not be problematic for people. So while they do like rodents, they won't pass up other meals, particularly easy meals. So if you have backyard birdhouses and don't want to feed predators like snakes, it's very, very important that you put up proper predator guards and put them in the right space. So can't blame the snakes for wanting to eat. Everybody's got to eat. And if you make it easy, they're certainly going to take advantage of that situation. So with that, I do want to really, talk about the fact that it's okay to be afraid of snakes. If snakes aren't your thing, I completely understand. They weren't my thing for a very, very long time. And every now and again, I still kind of get the flutters when I see snakes. So I do want to validate that it's completely okay to be afraid of snakes. But I do want to also preface it that it's not okay to kill a snake because you're afraid. So, you've probably heard people say things like the only good snake is a dead snake. How would you feel if somebody said, well, the only good bobcat's a dead bobcat? Why do we look at snakes and other things like reptiles and amphibians in a different lens than mammals and birds? So these species have every right to exist, and they just need to respect their space, just like, other species. You wouldn't go run up and try to catch a bobcat, and if you would, that's a very bad idea. So don't do it with a snake. Just give them their space. Let them do their thing. They're afraid of you, and let them, be who they want to be and on their own and all of that. And usually that's how you can avoid negative encounters. So as I went through, I did allude to some of the problems that our reptiles and amphibians are experiencing collectively. It's estimated that 1 in 5 reptile species are threatened with extinction, and as much as 40% of our amphibian species worldwide are threatened. So the number one threats are the habitat loss and degradation, and what that looks like really varies by the different species. We also deal with a lot of invasive species, and those are non-native species that cause problems. Sometimes these invasive species are invasive plants, which have changed those habitats. Sometimes they're invasive predators, like feral cats. There are many different things that can affect our different reptile and amphibian species. We also have climate change happening. Being ectothermic and really depending on your environment for temperature and all of that can really challenge a lot of these animals when we have temperature swings. We have these severe weather events and things like that. Some of our species, like our turtles, the sex dependency of their eggs is all based on temperature of the nest. And so we start to see sex ratios getting skewed as the climate changes. So there are a lot of things that are happening in that regard. We also have diseases that are happening with our different reptiles and amphibians. Diseases that are here, like rhinovirus and chytrid fungus. Diseases that aren't here, like ESOL, which affects our salamanders. It's found over in Europe and Asia. And then ones that affect our snakes, like snake fungal disease. And I know somebody had a question about snake fungal disease prior to this. I don't have time to go over it, but I'll send the link to the Park Disease Task Team that has fact sheets that goes into more of these things. The last thing on this list is apathy and persecution, because again, going back to that phrase, the only good snake is a dead snake, right? We hear that a lot. Oh, it's just one turtle that I'm taking. But that actually can affect a population by taking out a slow-growing, long to mature species. And so it's important, again, to keep that in mind and treat reptiles and amphibians just like you would treat a bird or a mammal or some other animal, and not persecute them just because they have scales or slime. So don't want to end on some bad notes. I want to think about ways that we can help our herps collectively. And obviously, I'm here today, and I was very much involved with Project Wild for a number of years and still continue to be, because education is key. So education and appreciation. Education is what got me here. You know, I used to scream bloody murder if I saw a snake outside. Like up through like high school, I was terrified of snakes. So, you know, it took a long, people who were very passionate, who were patient, help teach me to understand and appreciate these different species. So I hope you walk away with some of that knowledge and you can pass it on after this presentation. Some other things that you can do collectively is to help create habitat. Planting plants that are native to your area, encouraging things like invertebrates. Like our box turtles are omnivores. So you plant strawberries, raspberries, they're going to eat it up. They're also going to be out there eating the worms, eating the slugs, eating snails and other things. And if you're killing all of those things, you're inadvertently poisoning some of their foods that they would be depending on. So that brings me to my last point here about limiting pesticide use. And I'm not an advocate for eliminating pesticide use, but using it when you've exhausted all other options, when you've thoroughly researched it and there's no other way to get past some pest problem that you're experiencing, and making sure you're using it within the guidelines that are printed on the project and keeping yourself safe in that process. It's all about using things the right way to tackle our problems. When dealing with things like turtle species, we like to say get the shell off the road. So if it's safe to do so and you can help them essentially cross to the other side, which they're trying to go to, do that. So if you feel comfortable with snakes, you can help them too, because you'll also find them on roads and they can get run over. So road mortalities are big for a lot of our species. We also like to really encourage people to keep wild animals wild. It might be legal to collect some of these species from the wild in some of the states that you might be in, but we're starting to see some population declines. And there's certainly a lot of animals that are in shelters and rescues that could use homes. So try to adopt and do all of that before considering taking a wild animal from the wild. And if you do have a wild reptile or amphibian, make sure you're not releasing it. Not only if it was taken from the wild, so in places like Maryland, if you've had an animal, a reptile or amphibian collected from the wild in captivity for more than 30 days, you're not legally allowed to release it. So keep that in mind and make sure that's part of your plan if you want to have that animal as a pet. So certainly no captive animals. Like some of the issues with bullfrogs are because people have released pets. So we have some issues with some disease transfer because people have released pets. So don't ever release captive animals as well. One other good piece of advice for anybody going outside is just to do some disinfection of your shoes and your equipment. And on that Wakelet, I'll provide a link to some disinfection videos. It's just a good process. Not only does it help kill any potential pathogens that you might be transporting with your shoes, but also with invasive species, there are a lot of invasive plant species, seeds and roots and things like that. Means that they can get stuck in the treads of your shoes and easily passed on to some of your favorite places in the world. So before I end, I want to let you know that we do have a couple amphibian and reptile awareness weeks coming up in May. So we are 1 month out from Amphibian Week, which is a celebration of all things amphibian, and then Wild Turtle Week, which is all about wild turtles and keeping them wild. So I hope you check out the park channels and look for Amphibian Week and Wild Turtle Week and consider participating. So mostly at this time, these are social media campaigns to raise awareness, but we also have education activities and resources, and we're planning some activities that go along with these as well that you might be able to get involved and engaged in. So I'm running short of time, so I am just going to jump to questions if I have that time.
Yeah, Carrie, thank you so much. I always learn so much from Carrie, so I appreciate that. There are 3 questions we have in the Q&A portion. So one person asks, do you know for sure if the gray rat snake is a subspecies of the black rat?
There's a great debate happening with rat snakes, and I'm not fully up on it, but I know a couple years ago when some of the genetics work came out about gray rat snakes versus black rat snakes versus the Florida Everglades. There were like 6 or 7 subspecies of rat snakes in the eastern United States. They all got lumped together and split based off of geographic barriers like the Appalachian Mountains, the Mississippi River, and all of that. There was a lot of back and forth. You could make or break friendships by what side you fell on the great rat snake debate. And I'm not quite sure where it has landed a couple years later. But that's a very long answer to your question is yes, maybe. Depending if you're a lumper or a splitter, if you want to, lump them by colors and behaviors or genetic characters, they might be the same or different.
Fair enough. Stay tuned, right?
Yeah.
That's the best thing about science, right? Is it does change as we learn more information and are able to gather more and more detailed data about different species. Another question is, when finding a snake that is small, is there a best place to release it?
Good question. I see Noreen asked that question. So it really depends on the snake species. And since you're in Maryland, Noreen, you can go on the Maryland DNR website and find the Common Snakes of Maryland photo guide that has some of the juveniles and ID characters. A lot of them that you're going to find in the basement in Maryland are going to be like juvenile rat snakes, brown snakes, or sometimes your ringnecks. And placing them outside in cover, like under some logs or by a rock pile or something like that's usually the best. So that juvenile rat snake that I found, it was like right around Thanksgiving. So the next day it got up to 60 degrees and I sent it out to my wood pile. And I only put it out there just because the laundry room isn't the best place for a snake to hang out in the winter. Didn't want to accidentally step on it or anything there. So yeah.
All right. And another question is, being exothermic, does that mean that southern species of reptiles and amphibians might move north for the cooler climates? Is there I know they like to be warm, but can they get too warm?
Well, that also is a question that's kind of species dependent. So we are seeing some species, reptiles and amphibians, that are starting to have range expansions northward, but it depends on different factors. It depends on whether or not the habitat is there. So it's not just the temperature, but it's the habitats they need, like types of forest or types of wetlands and all of that. And also other factors like the type of food that they eat. And some of them too, like the salamanders, can't move very far. So that northward expansion is a very slow process, and some of it might happen faster than the salamanders. And actually, Megan Gade, who is on the call, she is my coworker, and she studied climate change in salamanders. So she might be able to jump in a little bit more too.
A couple more quick questions. Box turtles, what's up with them? Why are they threatened? And what's the biggest contribution to that?
So they're not threatened like legally in all states. So it depends, like as you go northward in the eastern United States, I know that box turtles do have different legal designations. In Maryland, they don't have, they're not legally threatened or endangered, but there's certainly a species that we've noted declines on, and it's a species of concern. And so the declines are due to a myriad of factors. We've got habitat loss and degradation. They're long-lived, slow-growing species, so it's very hard for some of them also to get to the adult breeding stages. So I think with turtles, it takes like 5 to 10 years for them to be able to breed. And so they've got a whole host of hazards, from nest predators like raccoons and foxes and skunks digging up those eggs. We've got climate change skewing the sex ratios of those eggs that hatch. And then when those tiny little box turtles hatch, they're like chicken nuggets of the wildlife world. So everybody wants to eat them. And so they've got a lot of other things they got to fend themselves off from, including us. There are a lot of people that will pick up these turtles, not realize that box turtles have very specialized habitat needs and food needs, and also that they live a really long time. They can live like sometimes 50 to 80 years. So that's a really long-term commitment if you're going to take that box turtle in, which is why I suggest go and adopt instead of taking those wild ones out of the population.
All right, thanks, Carrie. And on a personal note, I am going to go out with a black light every time and look for the bioluminescence.
Yeah.
So thank you all for joining us today. Appreciate your time and your attention and your contributions to the chat. I will invite you to join us next week as we have another one of our colleagues, Jacob Blamford, who's going to present on win-win opportunities, nature-based solutions to help people and wildlife. And he's our climate adaptation manager here at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So if you haven't already, register for that. This is being recorded and we'll send out a link to the recording in a couple of days. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.